My name is David Fullmer, and this is Richard Yemm. We're partners at WR Immigration. And today we're talking about the H-1B lottery, new developments, and what happens next. And before we really get into it, Rich, a lot has happened in the last 24 hours. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, just as we thought we were out, they pull us back in. The deadline was supposed to be this morning at 9 a.m. Pacific time, kind of late yesterday afternoon. We suddenly got the email that honestly, I'd kind of been expecting that they've
You called it,
extended.
Rich. You called
I
it.
did. Yeah, I can't take credit. One of my best paralegals actually was mentioning I'd completely forgotten that they actually did this last year. They extended it an extra few days because right near the end, they had kind of a technical issue. People weren't able to do things. So kind of to make it fair, they kind of extended the deadline a little bit. So yeah, they've extended the registration deadline through until Monday, 9 a.m. our time, 12 noon Eastern. Doesn't really impact things too much, but I guess if there's people that kind of are really at the end or trying to kind of put an additional registration in, gives them a little bit of extra time to do that side of things. So that's always useful, particularly given the technical issues we've seen so far.
Right. Rich, what is your observation on how this new system worked this year?
So it's a good question. We could do a whole session talking about the various, technical issues that we experienced going through this. And it won't be particularly relevant because, they might have fixed everything by this time next year. But, there's a few things I'd like to kind of go over on that front. It would have been really useful if they'd have given us access to the system in advance so that we could really kind of explore and test it a little bit before it just suddenly kind of went live. Immigration was pretty good at, doing several sessions where they would show you, have questions about what the system looks like, how it all works, but they didn't record any of those. It was kind of just a situation where if you logged on, you could be talked through it, you could see how it worked, that kind of thing. But it did make it kind of tough from that perspective. I think the ability to, refer this across to a version where companies can view their side of the system and their access would have been really useful. But a few things that I would say are things that we could definitely take towards looking at next year and looking at the registration side of things. Definitely found a few people where they didn't have valid passports. That is definitely something next year that I think if any foreign national has a passport expiring fairly soon, it's worth making sure they jump on that fast and get that renewed in advance so we're not kind of up against it in those last few days. A few other things, there actually didn't seem to be a delete option for individual unwanted registrations. So we had a few HR partners where, they put in maybe 10, 15 different people for a registration, and then they decided, we don't want to move forward with this particular person. There wasn't really a good option to delete just one. It was a case of either you restart the whole thing and go through all of this again, or you just submit, lose your $10 and then delete it afterwards. So that was one of those other technical issues. But, I don't want to defend immigration on this, but you see bigger companies with larger budgets have technical issues when they're experiencing high volume. And, it's expected that would happen in this case, and it kind of did. But all in all, it seems to have worked out well. We had a few glitches. There was a glitch with the G28 system for a while that got resolved. There were issues yesterday morning where certain things weren't linking up, or the system was down for a period, and that's ultimately why they extended it a little bit longer. But yeah, I think all in all, it ended up working out okay, although I would always recommend with anything when it comes to technology, you don't particularly want to be submitting in the first few days because the glitches, the issues are still being resolved at that point. You also don't want to end up leaving anything to right the last minute because, again, there's often a huge surge of people applying at that point and the system goes down and there's problems like that. So all in all, that's kind of our analysis as to the technical issues that we've experienced. But David, what happens next? Where do we go from here?
Well, now we wait on pins and needles to see who is going to be lucky enough to be selected in the lottery. People who are administrators on an employer's MyUSCIS account will receive an email that there's been some activity on their MyUSCIS account. And when they log on, they'll see one of four statuses, either submitted, selected, not selected, or denied. And so we'll go through each one of these. Submitted really means nothing. It means a person's status will stay as submitted all the way to the end of the process until the lottery is done, unless they're selected. So submitted really means no action at all. Selected, of course, yay, that means the person was selected in the H1 lottery, and the petition can be filed according to the instructions on the selection notice, which are going to say that it needs to be filed before June 30th. Not selected, those are people who were not lucky enough to be selected, and that status should not show up until the complete lottery process has been completed. And then denied will be the status if there was some type of issue or violation, such as an employer filing a duplicate application for the same employee. Of course, we know that it's okay this year for beneficiaries to have applications filed by multiple employers. So the next question that's coming up a lot, the big question of the hour, is when will the lottery selection happen? The recent announcement from the USCIS extending the deadline to Monday specifically said that the selections will still be made by March 31st. And in past years, the selections have kind of trickled in for a few days before the deadline. So we may see some selections starting to happen on the 28th, 29th, 30th, and then a surge around the 31st. Another question that's coming up even now, people are wondering, well, number one, will I be selected? And then finally, if I'm not selected on March 31st, will there be additional rounds? And, we don't know the answer to that right now. In some years in the past, there have been multiple rounds of selections. So that's always a possibility. In the past, I think there are 2 years that there have been additional rounds of selections in July, and 1 year there was an additional round of selection in November. So it's a possibility. But my opinion is that this year, with the new beneficiary-centric system, there's probably a lower chance of multiple rounds.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think given the new situation, I think it's unlikely there's going to be a second lottery, but live in hope, if that it's possible, but even if there is, there's less numbers for them to pick at that point. So yeah, it's
right. That's a very good point. People in the past were kind of hanging on and not kind of moving on to other alternatives when they weren't selected, really hoping that they would be selected in the next round. And I would say that even if there is another round, the likelihood is so low that employers really need to look for the next option if they're not selected at the end of March. But Rich, for those who are selected, most of them are going to be people who are in F1 status, doing their OPT, and I think there's going to be questions about the cap gap. How does that work?
Yeah, so cap gap is great. I love it. The idea, just for people who aren't familiar, if let's say your OPT, the employment authorization card, expires in June, somewhere around that kind of time, the H-1B, even if you're selected and even if it's approved, it doesn't kick in until October 1st. So there was always this gap in employment authorization between when OPT expires and H-1B kicks in. So what they've allowed is cap gap. So as long as you've filed your H-1B, you get this automatic extension of your employment authorization from June, when your OPT expires, through until October 1st, which is great. But consideration for employers moving forward is really looking into that, making sure you know when that OPT expires. Because if that OPT expires in early May or late April, having the H-1B registration in there is not enough. You also need to file that petition. So that petition has to have been filed. If you've been selected, you've got 3 months basically to prep and file this petition ordinarily. But if you're in a situation where the OPT is expiring sooner, you better get on that, because you need to make sure that petition is filed. We always say with cap gap, make sure that the employee, that they remain in close contact with their DSO at their school to ensure that they're updated. Because typically the way this works is, once you file the actual petition, it should be updated within CVIS with the H-1B petition data. Sometimes the DSO has to contact the SEVP Resource Center just to make sure that's all done. But that allows them to continue to be employment authorized. If in the alternative, there are situations where OPT is already expired, but the person's in their grace period, you've got a 60-day grace period. You still need to make sure you file that H-1B petition before the end of that grace period to allow you to be kind of automatically extended through until October, but you don't get employment authorization in that situation. So you still need to do it to make sure you're allowed to remain here until that point. But yeah, just a few things timing-wise that you need to be aware of. And from an HR perspective, I think the other thing that's critical is making sure that you're aware that you have to re-verify this person.
Right.
It's not just a case of you file the H, you're good. There are certain things that you have to do in the system on the I-9. I mean, typically on that case, yeah, again, certain things you have to make sure you're doing. You can email me if you want for a slide that kind of goes through exactly how we would recommend that you prepare the I-9 for someone who's in this cap gap period. Typically, I think we'd be looking at list A, documents, EAD, I-20, 797, receipt notice for the H-1B, and then remembering to re-verify no later than October 1st. Because as of October 1st, if you haven't heard back on the H, cap gap employment authorization extension ends. So you have to take the person off payroll for a period until that's actually approved. I guess that brings us to the next part. Like what happens next? Like, let's say you've got employees, they've been selected. What do the employers need to do to prepare and file?
So the selection notice will give instructions on when the petition needs to be filed, which will be within 90 days. So the selection notice for this initial round will state that the petition needs to be filed by June 30th. But as you mentioned, Rich, if somebody has an OPT that's expiring before that, it needs to be filed earlier than that. Some beneficiaries, some of the employees in your programs, when they're selected on March 31st, might ask that you file it immediately. They might have this idea that filing earlier will somehow benefit them. And that's definitely not the case. And so employers and HR departments should not be feeling pressured to file someone before their legal deadline, but they do need to make sure they file before the OPT expires or before June 30th, whichever is first. And no matter when it's filed, the earliest that a petition can be, where the H-1 status can be available, is, of course, October 1st. Which brings up another question, Rich.
Mm-hmm.
What do you tell employers about premium processing? Is it recommended? What are your thoughts on premium processing?
So premium processing is an interesting one. Oftentimes because they receive such a high volume of H-1B petitions, in this 3-month period, often immigration delays when they will start the premium processing clock going. So there's no guarantee that, if you file in the first couple of weeks of April, that they're going to straight away, take your premium processing and do it within 15 days. It's kind of a tough one to really know, because if you're filing in April, May time, even if the H-1B gets approved, it doesn't really kick in until October 1st. So there's a few months there that you don't necessarily need to rush and do premium processing. But at the same time, it can be useful from the perspective that we've had situations via regular processing where you reach October 1st and that H-1B still hasn't been approved. And as I mentioned, if the H-1B hasn't been approved by October 1st, kind of can't work until that's actually approved. So you might need premium processing. Remember, you can upgrade down the line. You can always upgrade to premium processing if you get closer to that point. Couple of pointers on premium processing. I'm sure people are aware, but premium processing fee has increased to $2,805. And also they've changed it. So it's not 15 calendar days anymore. It's 15 working days. So we're looking at, instead of just over 2 weeks, we're looking at more like 3, sometimes just over weeks for them to adjudicate the case. And if you add to that the fact that immigration may say premium processing, we don't start the clock until this particular date, right, it could still take a bit of time. But I think from an employee perspective, it's nice to have premium processing sometimes, because you at least know where you stand. If you have a case that's maybe not the strongest, and just for peace of mind, sometimes you just would prefer to have an approval and know, okay, I'm sorted, I've got this approved, it's going to kick in from October 1st. So I think that side of things can work.
I agree. There's that employee peace of mind. Plus, if you file without premium processing, you're waiting and maybe close to September, you get an RFE. And if you respond and you're not premium processing, then you're definitely going to miss the cap gap deadline on October 1st. So
Right.
there are a couple of reasons you want a premium process.
Yeah. And I think travel as well. Sometimes if people are looking to travel, which we'll probably get onto later, like it's better to at least have that approval and that side of things. But don't worry, it doesn't increase or reduce the chance of approval. I've always heard people being a little bit superstitious with premium processing. Yeah, you get the one side where people say, well, premium processing, they don't have as much time. So maybe they're stricter, or there's higher level officers that are going to be just tougher on my case because I'm asking for them to do it fast. I haven't really seen any particular
I
difference in
haven't.
adjudication trends. It doesn't increase the chance, doesn't reduce the chance.
And it doesn't accelerate the effective date of the H-1B just because the petition's approved.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. It still kicks in from October 1st. If you've got cap gap, you're good anyway. But yeah, from a planning perspective, from the employer perspective, if they've got multiple registrations that were selected and they want to know that they can bank on this person being able to work from October 1st, particularly if it's a weaker case, maybe more of a market research analyst type position or something like that, they might just want that additional security. And speaking about the fees, we know that the premium processing fee increased. I guess that's something else that we should be thinking about, right?
Definitely, definitely. So in addition to premium processing, employers need to remember that as of April 1st, there will be new higher government filing fees for all the rest of the different types of petitions, including H-1Bs. So make sure that that as you're filing those petitions, you're checking and utilizing the additional filing fees. It's unfortunate, but that's a fact. Seems like the price on everything goes up, including immigration.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I read that now the cost of working in the U.S. is one of the highest of any country in the world. I'm talking about the government filing fees. Filing fees are very high and they're going up. But the most important thing is to realize that they are going up. And the other thing that's nice is that as of April 1st, H-1Bs will be available to file within the USCIS's online system. Although paper filing will still be available, we're now modernizing this particular program, and now H-1Bs can be filed completely online. Although what I believe is a little glitch is that at least this year, the H-4s for the dependents cannot be filed online within that system. That's a little issue that hopefully they will improve and work on for next year.
Yeah, and one other thing I do want to mention as well is, we've talked about this. Once the H-1B window opens, you've got that 3-month period, right? And I mentioned with OPT, if your OPT is expiring sooner, you probably want to file it sooner. But there's also the issue of you've got 3 months. Do you need to get on and file straight away? Do you want to leave it till the end? Very similar to what I talked about with the registration window. Typically, it's not a great idea to do it straight away. Also, not necessarily right close to the deadline. There's things that you should really be working on early in the deadline in case there's delays, right? So in that period, in that filing window, things like the LCA, the evaluations, the earlier in that period that you can get on with those things, the better. Because if there's any issue with Department of Labor systems when it comes to the LCA, if there's any issues with evaluation, getting an evaluation of education, I think those are things that should be done as early as possible.
I agree that it'll take a week to get the LCA certified,
Exactly.
even if things are working well. It could take a week or more to get an evaluation. If it's a tricky one, it could even take a couple of weeks. So that's a very good point.
Yeah. And I think that's the problem as well, right? The evaluation agencies are all going to be potentially inundated with requests during at least those first few weeks, and potentially near the end if there's employers leaving it till the last moment. So definitely good to plan ahead. Speaking of which, David, did you want to talk about travel at all during this time?
Sure, I'll touch on it. Travel is a little bit tricky because the vast majority of people who are involved in the H-1B lottery are F1 students. Many of them do have valid F1 visas. And during the cap gap, they, if they're selected, they remain in valid H-1B status. So the question comes up, can these people travel? It's a long time between April 1st and October 1st. They might have to go to a wedding, a funeral, or just want to travel home to see family. Can they do it? And this question comes up a lot. And I would say that this is kind of a delicate issue. And so if you have employees that want to travel during this period, again, these are people who are selected in the lottery, they should consult closely with their immigration attorney, with the company's immigration attorney. But what I will say is that the USCIS has published instructions on this on their website. So according to the USCIS, an F1 student may generally travel abroad and seek readmission to the United States in F1 status during the cap gap period if three conditions are met. First one is that the petition and request for change of status has been approved, not pending. It's already been approved.
So that would be a good time to get premium processing, I guess, right?
Right. Oh, yeah. It's not going to be an option at all unless they utilize premium processing. Next, the student needs to seek readmission before the H-1B employment begins. In other words, before October 1st.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the student has to be otherwise admissible. There can't be any other issues. So that's what it says on the USCIS website. But the website also says that, U.S. Customs also has full discretion to make whatever decision they deem to be appropriate during that specific situation and during that inspection. So that's why you need to consult closely with counsel if you have an employee who wants to travel during this cap gap period.
Yeah, and I think we're probably just about at time. We could talk a little bit about alternatives, but we've gone through that a bit before. I mean, it is a good time if the employee is not selected to look at these alternative options, O1, L1 visa, all these kind of things. But yeah, I mean, I think otherwise that pretty much does it for us for today. Thanks so much for tuning in or
Thank you, everyone.
logging on. And please do leave comments or share us a message if you have any other questions specifically on this side of things. We'll be happy to help. But yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you.